Hey guys, today I'll show you a horror thriller film named Bone Tomahawk. Spoilers ahead, watch out and take care. The movie begins in the wilds of the American West, where a ruthless gang of bandits, blood-soaked from their latest raid, began their retreat. But they hadn't gone far when they saw a massive totem on the ground. Two of them barely had time to react before falling to arrows from unseen attackers. This place was clearly fraught with danger lying in wait. The small town of Hope Springs lay nestled in the desolate West, a place known for its simple folk and abundance of cowboys. 11 days after the bandits' attack, a stranger arrived at the town bar during the busy harvest season. Despite his suit and polished appearance, his actions, burying his luggage outside, caught the attention of Chicory, a local. The sheriff, hearing of this strange behavior, joined Chicory at the bar to question him. The stranger introduced himself, the same name as one of the bandits recently sent to meet his maker. The sheriff immediately grew suspicious, noticing his hesitation when giving his name. Realizing his cover was blown, the stranger shoved old Chicory aside and bolted, but the sheriff didn't hesitate, shooting him in the leg. The town doctor was called in to tend to the stranger, even though she had another patient to look after at home. Her husband, Arthur, had recently broken his leg and was recovering, a rare chance for the couple to spend time together. The injury had brought them closer, and their days were filled with affection. Just as they were enjoying a quiet evening, a knock on their door interrupted them. It was Bruder, bringing news that a patient needed urgent care. Arthur's wife gathered her medical bag and headed to the jail, only to find the man needed surgery to remove a bullet. A young deputy was reluctantly left behind to assist, tasked with locking up once the procedure was done. After ensuring everything was in order, the sheriff and Chicory donned their coats and left. They assumed this case would be routine, but in the dead of night, something disturbed the stable. The stable boy was ambushed and struck down instantly by an axe-like weapon that split him open from head to chest. By morning, the grisly scene was discovered. A farmer reported the incident to the sheriff, explaining that it wasn't just the stable that had been attacked. The jail had also been breached. The prisoner, the young deputy, and Arthur's wife had all vanished, leaving behind only a strange arrow lodged in a post. To determine if the arrow was of Native American origin, the sheriff consulted a local indigenous expert, using the time to break the tragic news to Arthur. On hearing his wife had been abducted, Arthur hurried to the bar, limping as the others gathered to plan their next steps. The indigenous expert recognized the arrow immediately, identifying it as belonging to the troglodytes, a primitive, brutal tribe that lived in caves outside society's bounds, without language. These people had long been shunned due to their practice of inbreeding and savage customs, living like beasts. The troglodytes were fiercely protective of their territory, hunting down any intruders without mercy. Hearing the sheriff's request to locate the tribe, the expert instinctively refused, knowing the risks. But Arthur, driven by desperation to save his wife, would not be stopped. Seeing Arthur's determination, the expert finally pointed to a spot on the map, a forbidden area surrounded by mountains, remote and barren. It would take at least 3 days to reach from town. Chicory and Bruder volunteered to accompany Arthur, with Bruder feeling personally responsible for having called Arthur's wife out on that fateful night. The four quickly packed their gear and prepared to leave. Arthur took with him a love letter he had written for his wife, vowing she would hear its words. The sheriff also brought her medical bag in case Arthur's leg gave him trouble. Time was of the essence as the four men rode across the barren plains. As night began to fall, they stopped to set up camp. Bruder strung a bell some distance away as a warning system, advising everyone that if the bell rang, they should shoot without hesitation. Whether it was a person or an animal, anything approaching could be a threat. After sharing a simple meal, they lay down on their makeshift beds, ready to sleep fully clothed. In the middle of the night, the bell chimed, and Bruder fired his gun, the loud shot waking the others. Fortunately, the night passed without further incident. The next day, as they pushed forward on their journey, Arthur's leg wound began to worsen. During a short rest stop, he slipped away to a secluded spot, rolled up his pant leg, and used some anesthetic from his pocket to numb the pain. However, the sheriff noticed, and at his insistence, Arthur had to hand over the remaining anesthetic. The group continued traveling without pause, but that night at camp, they were confronted by two uninvited guests. The intruders appeared silently, and rather than immediately opening fire, the sheriff tried to communicate with them. Brood, however, didn't hesitate. He fired 2 decisive shots, eliminating the threat. Convinced the intruders had ill intentions and that the area wasn't safe, the group decided to move camp and avoid lighting any fires. Unfortunately, danger wasn't done with them yet. In the middle of the night, a commotion jolted Arthur awake. Someone was on top of Brood, trying to kill him. Thankfully, Arthur's quick trigger finger saved the day, though it couldn't prevent the attackers from stealing their horses. Now, without their means of transportation, the four had no choice but to proceed on foot. Taking Arthur's injury into account, their pace slowed significantly. To avoid further attacks, they decided to rest during the day and travel at night. Determined not to hold the group back, Arthur carried only the bare essentials and pushed himself to keep up. The pain in his leg was excruciating, and he stumbled repeatedly, but he kept moving, even when the others were mere specks in the distance. By the time he finally caught up, his companions had been resting in place for hours. At dusk, they set out again, but an argument flared up between Arthur and Brood. Brood's comments enraged Arthur, especially when he realized Brood still hadn't changed and even harbored hormone feelings for his wife. Ignoring the pain in his leg, Arthur threw a heavy punch. Brood stubbornly barked back, but Arthur wasn't in much better shape. His outburst had worsened his wound. Seeing Arthur struggling to get up, Chicory fetched the medical kit to assess the damage. The wound had clearly deteriorated further, and the sheriff suggested Arthur abandon the journey. Arthur refused adamantly. There was no way he'd give up on rescuing his wife, and amputation was out of the question. He begged Chicory to secure his leg once more and asked for some time to recover. The sheriff promised to leave markers along the path in case Arthur wanted to continue on. After issuing his instructions, Chicory administered anesthetic to Arthur. As the surgery began, Arthur made one final plea for the group to save his wife. Once reassured, he slowly lay back. Chicory took a bone saw from the kit and glanced at the sheriff, who shook his head gently. Chicory then swapped for a small hammer, striking the bone with precision. By the time the operation was complete, night had fallen. The group left the still unconscious Arthur behind and pressed on toward their destination. By the time night had fully set in, the group heard a familiar call echoing through the darkness. Brood realized it was the same sound he'd heard on the night of the kidnapping. The sheriff initially feared their presence had been discovered, but the calls gradually grew fainter. Knowing these savage warriors were fearless fighters, it didn't make sense for them to retreat. This put the three of them on high alert. Brood began sharing his experience. Ever since his sister and mother had been taken by native tribes, he'd been on a relentless path of vengeance. Chicory's endless questions wore on the sheriff, but thankfully the night passed without any incident. As dawn broke, several villages came into view at the base of the mountain. With no way to pinpoint their destination through the binoculars, the three had no choice but to start searching the closest village. However, hoofprints at their feet caught their attention. After closer inspection, they found horses belonging to the town. The sheriff marked their spot with stones on the ground. Following the trail of hoofprints, they arrived at a mountainous area where an animal skull embedded in a slope made the sheriff uneasy. Brood took the lead, scouting the path for the others. He picked up a stone and told the two behind him that if he didn't signal within 30 seconds, they should run without looking back. Thankfully, he threw the stone within the time, allowing the sheriff and Chicory to move forward, weapons drawn, through the narrow mountain pass. A high cave opening became visible on the opposite cliffside. Before they could make sense of it, sharp arrows sliced through the air, hitting Brood and the sheriff directly, sending them both to the ground. Chicory, though grazed by an arrow that scraped off a piece of his scalp, reacted swiftly, firing back and taking down one of the attackers. As the enemy fell, the weapon he had hurled smashed into Brood's arm, spraying blood and fragments of bone. Seeing this, the sheriff didn't hesitate. He fired his gun, taking down a nearly naked cave-dwelling enemy charging toward them. Thinking the immediate threat was over, Brood proposed a bold plan to sacrifice himself and blow up the cave to take out the enemy within. Chicory, deeply moved, lit a cigarette for Brood at his request. But before he could gather the resolve to act, new cave dwellers arrived, hurling a bone-crafted axe at Brood, who lay in the brush. Shots rang out in a quick, desperate burst, but his sacrifice ultimately couldn't secure an escape for his companions. Just as the sheriff and Chicory stumbled out of the mountain path, they were ambushed by a group of enemies. With too many attackers to fend off, they were swiftly overpowered and pinned to the ground. The sheriff was held down, a bone axe handle jammed into his mouth, with the weapon threatening to pierce through his skull. One of the cave dwellers picked up a rock and knocked the sheriff unconscious. As they were being hauled away, Chicory caught sight of Brood, who had taken down an enemy in a one-for-one struggle. Brood's skull was split open by a bone axe, and the two cave dwellers near him roared like wild beasts. Hearing the commotion, those inside the cave tossed down a rope from above. It turned out that these cave dwellers didn't live in the villages at the mountain's base, but in caves high up in the cliffs. When they were dragged into the cave, the sheriff finally saw Arthur's wife, who had been missing for so long. She was locked in a makeshift cage, looking disheveled but thankfully unharmed. She shared the cage with two others who had been captured. One was already dead and the other gravely injured. The corpse had become the cave dweller's meal. As mealtime approached, a snarling, fanged creature came to inspect the cage, roaring at the others outside. Two more joined in response, communicating through guttural growls. Under the leader's command, they opened the cage and grabbed the young man. He was barely clinging to life, unresponsive to the sheriff's calls, and perhaps it was a mercy he wasn't conscious to face the horror unfolding. The young man was stripped of his clothes, a gruesome preparation for the meal. Realizing this, the sheriff and Chicory tried desperately to break free, but the thick wrist-thick bars held firm. The young man briefly regained consciousness and tried to run but was quickly pinned to the ground. Hearing the sheriff's voice, the young man dutifully began to make a crime report, his professionalism moving the sheriff, who promised to honor his final wishes. Yet the cave dwellers were unmoved by this poignant farewell, seeing only their next meal. They tied up the young man and with bone knives carved into his forehead, mercilessly peeling away his skin in one swift motion. His screams echoed, and the cave dwellers stuffed his mouth with the skin to silence him, driving a long wooden stake through his skull with precise blows. The sheriff was horrified by their brutal method, hastily declaring he would act, but the cave dwellers ignored his threats. They raised the bone axe and hacked the young man's body in two. The sight and sound of cracking bone left the cage in dead silence as the carnage ended. After witnessing this bloodbath, the three captives sat in stunned silence, knowing Arthur was their only hope, but he was wounded and still had to face these ferocious enemies. Arthur's wife, furious and heartbroken at the thought of her husband coming to rescue her, lamented their recklessness. It was too late now. From what she had observed, there were still 12 cave dwellers in total, and even with the ones they had killed, 9 remained. The sheriff and Chicory staged a fake fight over a bottle of anesthetic-laced liquor, luring 3 gullible cave dwellers. Unfortunately, only one drank enough to be affected, leaving 7 opponents for Arthur. Meanwhile, Arthur had regained consciousness. Limping from his injury, he stumbled upon their belongings but realized the markers had stopped at the mountain path. Exhausted and on the verge of collapse, he found a shaded spot and drifted in and out of sleep. 2 cave dwellers were the first to spot Arthur's shadow. His hat, left to one side, distracted the enemies, giving Arthur the perfect chance to fire and take them down. However, these cave dwellers were incredibly tough. Even after being shot, one managed to draw his bow. Just as he was about to release the arrow, Arthur quickly reloaded and fired again, proving that even their primitive weapons couldn't outpace a handgun. On the fallen enemy, Arthur discovered a crucial item, a bone whistle attached to the throat, connected to the windpipe, which the savages used to communicate. Curious, Arthur removed the whistle from the cave dweller's neck and used its sound to lure nearby enemies. Now, the tide had turned in his favor. Using the whistle and his gun, Arthur fought his way into the heart of the enemy's lair. Meanwhile, the sheriff's tactics had been discovered. The cave dwellers dragged him out of the cage, slashed open his abdomen with a sharp blade, and stuffed a scorching metal flask into the wound. The searing pain had him screaming in agony until he was nearly unconscious. As he was about to become their next meal, Arthur made a dramatic entrance, using the bone whistle. One of the cave dwellers, standing over the sheriff, had figured out how to use the sheriff's rifle. The sheriff shouted a warning just as the gunshot pierced through the enemy's abdomen. Fearing Arthur might not win this fight, the sheriff fumbled for a bone saw dropped by a cave dweller, summoning his remaining strength to chop off the enemy's toes. The sudden pain made the savage stumble, giving Arthur an opening to pull the trigger. As the cave dweller fell beside him, the sheriff immediately finished him off. Working together seamlessly, Arthur managed to rescue his wife, but the sheriff was beyond saving. He told Arthur to take Chicory and leave, volunteering to stay behind and finish off the remaining 3 cave dwellers. After an emotional farewell, Arthur handed the rifle to the sheriff and led his wife and the others back the way they had come. As they left, they passed a totem made from bones and stones. Across the desolate landscape, 3 gunshots echoed in the distance. The final 3 gunshots in the distance carry a sense of unresolved anticipation, leaving us with a sliver of hope that the sheriff might survive. However, one poignant scene stands out. As Arthur and his wife leave the cave, they encounter a pregnant female captive. What fate awaits her unborn child? This is Daniel CC Movie Channel. Stay safe and enjoy your day.